In this session, we're going beyond Scripture and into the early church history, examining what the earliest Christians had to say or didn't say about Mary. If you haven't already, smash that like button below and subscribe to the channel to help grow the ministry and to fulfill the Great Commission by spreading the gospel to the ends of the earth. In part 1, we unpacked everything the New Testament has to say about Mary, the mother of Jesus, and it's beyond clear that the text and context do not align with any so-called Mariology teaching that the Roman Catholic Church holds to, or with the Orthodox views either. Both groups share most of the Marian doctrines with a couple of variations. The Roman Catholic Church has made the Immaculate Conception and Assumption of Mary official dogmas under ex cathedra, with even declaring that a person is condemned if they reject these teachings. So, according to these guys, is that basically everyone should stop holding up John 3:16 signs at sporting events. So, since neither can appeal to the New Testament, is that they refer and defer to what the early church fathers had to say. But what did these guys actually have to say or didn't say about Mary? In part 2 and 3, we have seen no references to Mary from the Didache, First Clement, or Papias. Papias is part of the earliest 2nd century group, and collectively, him, Ignatius, and Polycarp are seen connected with the Apostle John per the testimony of Irenaeus, along with Ignatius's letter to Polycarp, and Polycarp referring to Ignatius and his letters in his letter to the Philippians. Eusebius summarizes these three together, saying that they held office during the same time frame. Polycarp was a disciple of the apostles, Papias was the bishop of Hierapolis, and Ignatius was the bishop of Antioch. In part 4, we are going to be sifting through all of Ignatius's 7 considered authentic works. I say it that way because there's actually 3 different groups of letters. The short Syriac recension has been dismissed by text scholars, being an abbreviated translation of just 3 of the 7. The longer recension has the 7, but greatly expands, like doubling, on the content in each of the letters, along with 6 additional letters into the mix. A simple example of the longer expanding is in the letter to Smyrna by adding the name Polycarp, as just likely a clarifier to which bishop Ignatius was referring to. An example of, holy cow, did that guy get carried away, is in Ephesians chapter 7. You can see the length of the longer is greater than doubling the length of the shorter. And then, if you were to look at the expansion wording, is that it greatly theologically is developed, giving an indication that the text is coming post-Nicene Creed timeframe. A simple reason to reject the longer recension is that Eusebius says that Ignatius wrote Ephesians, Magnesians, Trallians, and Romans while in Smyrna. Then once he's moved to Troas, is that he writes Philadelphians, Smyrna's letter, and also the one to Polycarp. This is just 7 letters, with no mention of those additional 6. So, if Eusebius wrote that statement in around 320 AD, is that it stands to reason that the additional 6 letters came much later and hence can be rejected, including the so-called correspondence with the Virgin Mary. That false letter was done by an unknown author writing under the guise of Ignatius. It's a pseudepigraphal false authorship work at the end of the day. It's short, but you can see how the author is creating a false narrative and adding in the line about Ignatius being a disciple of John. The intent to do this is to create a scene to validate the notion that whatever Ignatius wrote and then must have come from the Apostle John himself in terms of certain doctrines that Ignatius brings up. The unknown author is essentially just inventing a false history in the void of historical documentation regarding if there was any type of direct interaction between Ignatius, John, and Mary. So, when Catholic publishing sites like Aletheia here post an article like this one, is that it shows that there's either a complete lack of historical understanding on this topic, or simply that their intent is to validate their Marian doctrines even at the cost of historical accuracy, which at least the Roman Catholic Church admitted in their Catholic Encyclopedia around 1907 AD that the six spurious works, including the Virgin Mary one, are completely false. Didn't yet Aletheia, in a common day article, didn't mention that at all either. All that said is why the shorter middle recension is seen as the original, authentic works of Ignatius. Now, this then raises the question of why did Ignatius even write these letters to begin with? The easiest way to contextually understand these epistles is by thinking of Paul's prison epistles. Paul is under house arrest in Rome when he writes Ephesians, Philemon, Philippians, and Colossians. The only difference here is that Ignatius in his letters they're getting penned while he was being hauled from Antioch to Rome, stopping in Smyrna, then to Troas, and then he eventually gets taken all the way to Rome. Eusebius says that he wrote Ephesians, Magnesians, Trallians, and Romans while in Smyrna. Then once moved to Troas, he writes Philadelphians, Smyrnans, and one to Polycarp. Eusebius got this, though, directly from the letters themselves, as the four get written from Smyrna, as each one of those stated, and Philadelphians and Smyrnians come from Troas. Then Polycarp's letter comes as Ignatius is being transported from Troas to Neapolis, which is in Macedonia, northern Greece. Jerome says on Illustrious Men that Ignatius was martyred in the 11th year of Emperor Trajan, which dates to basically 108 to 109 AD. Now, giving the journey from Antioch to Rome some matter of time is that the letters then could be said dated around 107 AD. Ignatius's martyrdom in Rome likely occurred in the Colosseum as sport and entertainment. Now, there are critical scholars out there that try to late date Ignatius's letters because, well, this goes back to everything I said in the Rapture series and many other times as well, is that if you late date his works, let me put it this way, if his letters were early, is that then the whole narrative about trying to late date the New Testament books starts to fall apart. And if that falls apart, then you go immediately into the problem of Jesus' prediction of the temple destruction, which occurred in 70 AD. That would be him predicting that 40 years in advance, and also the eyewitness accounts on the resurrection. Christian persecution was, though, occurring under Trajan, and the best primary source evidence of this is from Trajan himself, in correspondent letters between him and Pliny the Younger. Pliny was the governor of Bithynia province, which was the northern part of Turkey at that time, and this is not part of the trail, if you were, that Ignatius was traveling while being hauled from Antioch to Rome. But in a letter to Trajan, Pliny says the following: I have never participated in trials of Christians. I therefore do not know what offenses it is the practice to punish or investigate, and to what extent. Meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I have observed the following procedure. I interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. Interjecting for a moment here, is because Pliny flat out says that Christians who don't deny their faith are getting the death penalty. The next section, Pliny describes Christians as a whole, as a community, and how they worship and behave. They, Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to do any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. This description is secular confirmation of what exactly the Bible and early church writings all say. Christians met on a fixed day, Sunday, worshiped Jesus as God, and held communion or communal feasts together, which included the Lord's Supper, and yet these behaviors, basically do unto others as you would have them do unto you, love thy neighbor, and all that stuff, was the death sentence to them per Pliny. Pliny continues saying, these were others possessed of the same folly, but because they were Roman citizens, I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome. This is exactly what happened to Paul in Acts 25, appealing to meet before Caesar, as the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees were trying to kill Paul for his testimony about Christ in Jerusalem. And this is now where Emperor Trajan writes his response to Pliny, and he says the following. You observed proper procedure, my dear Pliny, in sifting the cases of those who had been denounced to you as Christians. If they were denounced and proved guilty, they are to be punished, with this reservation, that whoever denies that he is a Christian and really proves it, that is, by worshiping our gods. The takeaway here is that Trajan basically commends Pliny for his judgment style and supports everything that he has been doing so far, which includes executing those who didn't deny their faith in Jesus Christ. So, if you ever come across people, including professors, journalists like Kenita Moss here, denying Christian persecution, just realize they are lying and trying to water down the clear-cut case that Christians were brutally treated by the Romans until Constantine legalized all religions, it's not just Christianity, all religions in 313 AD with the Edict of Milan. So, Ignatius being taken to Rome to suffer is 100% historically reliable. Was he a Roman citizen who had the right to go before Caesar? Likely not, as beheading would have been the method for Roman citizens, like in the case with Paul. Ignatius's death in the arena was for slaves and non-citizens. And as bishop of a Christian church, is that he was an easy target. So that takes care of the context and also the when with Ignatius and his letters. In terms of the length, is that Ephesians, his letter to Ephesians, is roughly 1,300 words long, while the other 6 range from 600 to 800 words. You can easily read all 7 in a couple of hours on earlychristianswritings.com if you want to go find a free source for them. Theologically, Ignatius is a valuable witness for demonstrating that the belief in Jesus as God has been a part of Christian beliefs since the beginning. And his statements are just explicit to the very bone. In Ephesians, Ignatius calls Jesus God 3 times early on, and in 9:1 is clearly making a Trinitarian statement here, with a couple more explicit Jesus is God statements towards the end of the letter. In Magnesians, he says Jesus was before the worlds, which is another Trinity statement here too. In the letter to the Trallians, there are none though. In Romans, he has 3 explicit statements. Philadelphians, there are none calling Jesus God, but he calls the Holy Spirit the Spirit of Jesus Christ, which is an equivalent of calling Jesus God. And this is the same thing that you would see in Paul's letter to the Romans in chapter 8. To Smyrna, there is 1, and to Polycarp, there are 2 statements there. That's 15 clear-cut, undeniable statements that Jesus is God, and also him affirming the Trinity. Now, those could give you the impression that Ignatius is working with John's gospel, because it's offering the most explicit statements calling Jesus God twice in his gospel compared to the other statements in the New Testament. It's very possible that Ignatius has read the Gospel of John. He uses the Greek word logos once in his letters, which only comes from John's works in the New Testament. But historically, one should just note is that the concept of the eternal logos wasn't necessarily something new that John did, but John was developing it or really making it clear, because there are roots for it in the Old Testament, along with Jewish Targums, and also that Philo of Alexandria at that time was writing his works, and he used the term logos a lot. He wasn't seeing it as, the incarnate word, as John was making that case. But you can still see John's Christology at work, and as his gospel is the only one where Jesus claims that he will raise himself, and that's something that Ignatius picks up on and states here as well. The closest quoting of Jesus for Ignatius is from Luke 24:39's post-resurrection appearance. This is still more of a paraphrase, though, and gleaning through all the letters is that you can't pin down Ignatius citing any Old Testament or New Testament verse. He paraphrases and blends together concepts and languages into his own voice. That's just his style, which makes sense when you're being hauled from Antioch to Rome by the Roman guard. Theologically, the situation that I see taking place here is that Ignatius is addressing the rise in Doceticism that taught that Jesus is God, but that they deny his incarnation, and that Jesus walking around on earth as God, and that his human form only seemed like it was human, but it really wasn't. It was just a fake apparition, if you will. This seems to be the same issue that John addressed in his letters, and being only 20 to 25 years difference between both of those guys' letters, is that Ignatius is likely battling the same heresy, and why his letters are loaded with defenses of the incarnation and bodily death and resurrection of God the Son. The only time Ignatius uses the phrase, "it is written," is in Ephesians 5:3, and one could only guess if he was trying to point the reader to Proverbs, 1 Peter, or James' use of that phrase. Personally, I see the letters containing more Pauline language than the others, but that makes sense since Paul's letters are 13 of the 27 New Testament books. Ignatius's statement here on the mysteries with Paul would be jogging their memory on Paul's letter to that church roughly 47 years before this, where he spoke on the mysteries of God. But Paul did this in other letters as well, like in Colossians. In Ephesians 15:3, Ignatius calls them God's temples, which mirrors the temple language that Paul used in both Corinthian letters, saying that we are the temple of God. Another connector is that Ignatius brings up Onesimus 3 times in the letter and says that he is the bishop right now in Ephesus. This is very likely the same Onesimus, the slave, that Paul sends to the Colossians and also is asking Philemon to restore back to him as his runaway slave. Colossians, Ephesians, Philemon, and Philippians were Paul's prison epistles, and the geographic distance between Ephesus and Colossae can be walked in a given day if you had to. So it's very likely Onesimus here has become the bishop of Ephesus just 47 years after Paul sent him with his prison epistles back to Colossae during his younger years. Ignatius does bring up Paul again, along with Peter, in his Romans letter, with possibly an oblique allusion to their martyrdom in Rome. First Clement did this as well, yet neither, though, allude to the tradition that Peter was crucified upside down and Paul beheaded, which would have been done for a Roman citizen, like stated earlier. Ignatius brings up Peter to the church in Smyrna when bringing up the post-resurrection appearance of Jesus to the apostles. Altogether, Peter and Paul are both named twice, with the apostles collectively occurring in 6 of the 7 letters. The point, the point that I am trying to make here is that you should expect and see common language and themes between all the letters, since they are essentially getting written all at the same time and all to the same geographic region, which is most evidently seen with Ignatius hammering on the concept of being submitted to the church's leadership. It's interesting that in Philippians 1, though, Paul refers to bishops, plural, for that city. I believe this shows that one bishop ruling a local church wasn't the model that originally began. Paul, in Titus 1, 5 through 7, uses elders and bishop interchangeably. And this follows as John refers to himself as an elder in 2 of his letters, and Paul in Acts 14:23 and 1 Timothy 5:17 is saying to appoint a plurality of elders in local churches, not one guy to rule them all. Another common theme in the letters is on the Lord's Supper. Now, I'm not going to address this topic, as that would just take us down a rabbit trail that would basically add another hour onto this discussion. Is Ignatius teaching and believing in transubstantiation? Highly likely from his statement to the church in Smyrna. Is that, though, connected to his defense of the incarnation against the fight against Doceticism? Highly likely as well. It is interesting that the last phrase to bring up here that I want to showcase is the prince of this world. This is referring obviously to the devil, i.e. Satan, which Ignatius did in 6 of the 7 letters. This phrase matches the Gospel of John's 3 uses, but you could also kind of see a glimmer of this in Paul's Ephesians letter in 2:2. Related to this is Ignatius's eschatological outlook, and this follows Paul's language very closely. The patiently waiting for Christ's return and the resurrection mirrors Paul's wording in Romans 8. Ignatius's statement on the last times is eschatos kairos, which, is kind of blending together Paul's 1 Timothy 4:1 use of kairos and also John's eschatos, hora, in 1 John 2:18, but Paul basically uses eschatos everywhere in all of his letters. Regardless, Ignatius's collective statement is another angle to show that early Christians held a futurist view and not a preterist view of Jesus' second coming. All of that said, is that it's easy to see the common language and themes between all the letters since they are essentially getting written all at the same time and to the same geographic region. Which takes us to the main question of how many times does Ignatius refer to Mary in his 7 epistles? And that number is 3. Which now raises, do any of those statements lend any support to any of the now held Marian doctrines in the Roman Catholic Church or the Orthodox? 2 of the 3 times Ignatius names Mary occurs in Ephesians and once in Trallians. In Magnesians, Romans, and Smyrnians, you have a reference to Jesus' birth, which is consistent thematically, like the other common topics within the letters. Magnesians 11:1 is kind of peculiar because Ignatius in this statement places the birth, crucifixion, and resurrection all during the time of Pontius Pilate. Now, is this a manuscript error potential? Or is this just Ignatius kind of being loose with the syntax, doesn't get too wordy about it? Because the translation, if you looked up on New Advent, this is the one they have as well. So I'm not, kind of framing it in any particular way. This is hard to think, though, that Ignatius would make such a kind of gross historical error. But it kind of is possible because Irenaeus himself claims that Jesus died in his late 40s, which would have placed the crucifixion past the time of Pilate. So these guys knowing exactly, all the governorship reigns and who they were over Syria and Judea and all history, maybe they don't have everything accessible to them. Maybe they don't have it all pinned down, which, kind of looking at Irenaeus' statement here, this is kind of a big one. Regardless, Magnesians 11:1's birth reference thematically matches the other Mary and birth references in the other letters. In Ephesians 18:2, Ignatius says Jesus was conceived in the womb of Mary. And 19:1 says the virgin birth and crucifixion were hidden from Satan. This, though, is not a statement in support of Mary's perpetual virginity. It's just simply about Jesus' birth and resurrection. The next verse, in 19:2, Ignatius describes the Bethlehem star from Matthew 2. He describes how the constellations, the sun, and the moon formed a chorus. Just look up Psalm 19 for that, which could very well be an allusion to Revelation 12 because of the astral language there, which includes the sun and the moon in the Virgo constellation. Please go watch the dating of the birth video that I've done on this. I unpacked it in great depth on what exactly the star was. And also, you can pinpoint Jesus' birth right down to the very hour on September 11th, 3 BC. Ignatius's last mention of Mary is in Trallians 9:1, simply saying that Jesus is the son of Mary. Both letters used seed or race of David language, which he does as well in Romans 7:3, which is just like Paul did in Romans 1:3, and similar to Galatians 4:4 being born of a woman. In the letter to Smyrna, Ignatius uses the phrase again and says Jesus was born of a virgin without naming Mary directly. Then goes on remarking about the death and resurrection of Jesus. These are all abbreviated gospel descriptions of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, which is why Ephesians 19:1 contextually cannot be used as support for the doctrine of perpetual virginity. That said, he goes on remarking about the death and resurrection of Jesus. These are all, again, abbreviated gospel descriptions of the life, death, and resurrection, just like he did in Trallian's 9:1. In regards to other women, is that Ignatius brings up some others 5 different times. In the letter to Smyrna and Polycarp is where all these are contained. Here he just mentions wives and widows. 13:2, Ignatius prays that Gavia may be grounded in faith and love. To Polycarp, he mentions the widows again. Then in 5:1, he tells the wives to love their husbands and the husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church, which is basically taking right from Paul's letter to the Ephesians in 5:25. And the final time in 8:2 to the wife of Epitropus. All of that said is that there is nothing from Ignatius to support any so-called Mariology teaching that the Roman Catholic Church holds to, or with the Orthodox views either. But rather, Ignatius's description of Mary doesn't go beyond what is written in the New Testament.
Reminder, hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, and leave a comment. And don't forget to visit us at justscripture.org. But in the meantime, stay salty.